Welcome to the first of a series of 4 videos that I decided to do on the genetics of Tourette's. This is part of an outreach program that I'm doing for the Pennsylvania Tourettes Syndrome Alliance, also known as PATSA. And like many of you watching, you have a kid with Tourette's. I have a daughter, Maddie, who's 24, who was diagnosed with Tourette's when she was about 7 years old. And I'm a scientist by training, and even for me, it was a very steep learning curve. I was reading up on Tourette's, I didn't know much about it, and I read that there was a genetic component to Tourette's. And I was very surprised to hear that because I looked at myself, my immediate family, my parents, my uncles, aunts, grandparents, and there was no sign of Tourette's. In fact, I didn't even see any sign of these co-occurring conditions like obsessive compulsive disorder or ADHD. There was nothing really obvious. So I didn't quite understand, how can there be a genetic component to it? How can it be hereditary? In other words, how can it propagate to the next generation? So I decided for our sort of Tourette's chapter, the Pennsylvania Tourette's Syndrome Alliance, to create these videos and actually reach out to several colleagues. In this case, Dr. Hyman and Dr. Tishfield, who are world famous geneticists at Rutgers University, actually working on the genetics of tic disorders. And together with 2 students in the University of Pennsylvania neuroscience program who actually parenthetically are working on projects for their PhD thesis on Tourette's. So with them, we're going to go on an exploratory adventure to understand the complex genetics that underlies Tourette syndrome. And we'll go deep into the biology of how genetics can be explained, how we should think about gene mutations, and how, in fact, some of the genes that become mutated and that confer increased risk for Tourette's might actually interact with different brain circuits. So I hope you enjoyed these videos, and let's get started. In this first video of the series, we're going to explore the question, is Tourette syndrome hereditary? And here I'm going to be interviewing genetic epidemiologist Gary Hyman from Rutgers University. One of the first questions I want to ask, because we're thinking about genetics, and a lot of us might have some idea about genetics, but not be 100% sure. So when was the first time that there was a realization that there might be a genetic component for Tourette syndrome? Are we talking back in the 1700s, or is this very recent?
So that's an interesting question. I have read through the original article transferred into English from and I'm sorry, my French is not so great, but something like Gilles Tourette, de la Tourette. So Tourette's paper that he published in 1885, I think it is. And he describes, I think, 9 patients with Tourette's. So basically what happened was he was working at a neurological clinic. His mentor, Charcot, told him to describe these set of patients. They seem to think they're different than other movement disorders, other neurological disorders. And so he did that, and then he published this article. Now, if you read through that, and I can get it in English, you can see that 2 of the 9 had a family member with tics. He noted in his description. So in some ways, he was already beginning to see something. Now, the concept of genetics back in 1885 was very different than it is now. I mean, Mendel and Darwin were 1860s, I think, and so that it's not that much. What was known is very little about genetics. So he was thinking about it, but then we went sort of the dark ages, similar to what was going on with autism. We know with that terrible term refrigerator moms and all that kind of stuff, where they used to think this was just purely a psychological condition. But then probably in the 1960s, they started doing these studies. And typically they were doing genetic epidemiological studies, which is something I do, in which you are doing various study designs that answer specific questions that it might be due to genetics. So first one is the disorder familial? Does it run in family?
So what does it mean when we say a disease runs in families? Is that actually a really good way to evaluate if there's a genetic basis, or could it be due to the environment? And so what I did is I asked my student, Sarah Ferrigno, to explain a little bit more about how scientists evaluate family pedigrees to assess whether or not a disorder such as Tourette's, or maybe even more broadly chronic tic disorders, actually runs in families.
In these diagrams, female family members are represented by circles, and male family members are represented by squares. Parental relationships are represented with a connecting line, and to show the children resulting from that pair, we use branches offshooting those connections. Individuals affected with Tourette's are marked with a completely shaded shape, as seen in the mother here, and to mark the expression of chronic tic disorder, or the presence of tics that don't meet the full criteria of Tourette's, shapes are half shaded, as seen here. Unaffected individuals, like the father and daughter, remain unshaded. In family studies, direct relatives are often given more focus than more distant relatives, since children have about 50% of the same DNA as their mother, father, or other siblings, meaning that these first-degree relatives are much more genetically similar to each other than they are to more distant relatives. By looking at how taking clusters within groups of these direct descendants in a family, we can determine how frequently Tourette's and other chronic tic disorders seem to be getting passed on. However, one important thing to note when talking about family studies is that while direct families do share genetics, they often share the same living environment too, which could also contribute to the expression.
So what are these environmental risks? I asked Dr. Hyman, and he said they could be things like diet, like religion, like wealth. Nevertheless, these family studies have consistently shown that Tourette's runs in families, and it's suggestive that in addition to these environmental factors, there is a strong genetic component. Again, here, Dr. Hyman.
These studies started showing that indeed, that it is familial, that Tourette's is familial, and that other chronic tic disorders, that's a chronic motor tic disorder or chronic vocal tic disorder, but you don't have both motor and vocal. That's another how we currently split these disorders out in the Bible of what we do, which is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But these studies are showing that they're probably not any really different. So that's one kind of stuff. So it does show it's familial. And then in these heritability studies, these twin studies, they show that there's a good evidence that there is a genetic component.
We hear a lot about these twin studies, but what makes them so special to study the genetic basis of something like Tourette's disorder? Again, here's Sarah Ferrigno with a short tutorial.
We use twin studies to determine exactly how involved shared genetics are for the inheritance of tic disorders. To do this, twin studies take advantage of the genetic differences between identical and fraternal twins. Since identical twins derive from one single fertilized egg split early in development, identical twins are almost completely genetically identical. However, fraternal twins originate from separate fertilized eggs from the very beginning, meaning they are no more genetically similar than typical siblings. Since the main difference between identical and fraternal twins are the amount of genes that they share with their twin, then if we see more identical twins sharing Tourette's than fraternal twins, we can suggest that the differences in the genetic similarity is what accounts for the differences in the expression of Tourette's. In one well-known study, scientists compared the similarity rates for Tourette's between identical and fraternal twins, and found that over 50% of identical twins shared Tourette's, compared to only about 8% of fraternal twins sharing Tourette's, which confirms that genetic predisposition plays a large part in Tourette's syndrome. Interestingly, when the criteria was broadened to include the presence of any tics at all, 77% of identical twins had similarity for ticking, compared to only 23% of fraternal twins.
People get very excited by the twin studies, and if you just look at them at face value, they seem to be incredibly sort of, like full 100% proof that this is a very strong way to look at genetic evidence, but I'm assuming it's more complicated than that.
It's definitely more complicated than that. Twin studies have, some benefit on understanding in a general sense is there is a genetic component, but some of these people who are doing these studies, they say that there's a 87.25% heritability, and that doesn't have a good meaning for really what the studies are doing. And there's some problems with these studies, but it's showing that there's if you just think of it in a general sense, is there a genetic component to the disorder?
Given the strong suggestion based on these twin studies that there is a strong genetic or heritable component to TS, I asked Dr. Hyman how we should think of TS in terms of comparing it to other disorders, maybe Down syndrome or diseases that we know are caused by a single gene, like sickle cell or Tay-Sachs disease. So again, here, Dr. Hyman.
So something like, I think you were going to ask me, what would be a disorder that might have a low heritability? Maybe Down syndrome, because that's a chromosomal error that often happens spontaneously. It doesn't often. There's a rare situation which it can run in families, but mostly it doesn't. Where something like Huntington's or Tay-Sachs or sickle cell, that is a high heritability. But I don't like to think, and I think people misunderstand the idea of heritability. So I think a better way of thinking about it is what is called a recurrence risk. And we recently published a paper on the recurrence risk for Tourette's and other chronic tic disorders. And basically what this is saying is, what if one person has the disorder, what's the chance that, let's say, another first degree relative, let's say a child, would have the disorder? And what we're showing is it's about 29% risk in that first degree relative.
As Dr. Hyman mentioned, heritability is not as straightforward a concept as you might imagine, and his new approach assesses recurrence risk. And he briefly described it, but I thought that maybe it would be a good idea to ask Sarah to give us a little tutorial on how recurrence risk is measured, which in itself is not entirely intuitive either, but I think Sarah does a very nice job summarizing it.
To understand how likely it is for chronic tic disorders to be passed on within families, we can estimate recurrence risk, or the likelihood that an individual with a chronic tic disorder has a first-degree relative that is also affected. To calculate recurrence risk, we first need to take into account the general population prevalence for tic disorders. This figure is a number that tends to be commonly seen when talking about chronic tic disorders and is estimated at about 1.6%, or roughly 3 in 200 people. However, we also need to take into account the increased family risk that we've been talking about. This number is estimated at a risk of about 18.7%, or if you had 200 siblings, roughly 38 of them would be affected. To account for both of these figures into the recurrence risk, we multiply these rates together. For chronic tic disorders, the estimated recurrence risk is about 29.9%. So, in this example family, if this woman has Tourette's disorder, the likelihood that one of her first-degree relatives also has a chronic tic disorder is almost 1 in 3.
It seems now we've been introduced to this new magic number, 29% recurrence risk. What does that mean? Does that really mean that if I have a kid, there is an absolute 1 in 3 chance that if I have Tourette's, they will have some sort of chronic tic disorder? It turns out it's a little bit more complicated than that. These are average numbers. Again, here's Dr. Hyman.
It's really important to know where this data comes from. The data is an average over all families that were done. So these studies are this recurrence risk comes not from a specific family that we don't know the DNA of. It's an average. Obviously, it's higher in males. Everybody knows it's higher in males than females. So that 29% is an average over both genders.
So when you say higher males than females, so I have a daughter. Is it higher that one of her siblings will have Tourette, or her offsprings will have Tourette's? Or does it mean that if her offspring is a male, that he will be more likely to have Tourette's.
So it's the risk is higher in the males, meaning that if she has a male, it's higher than the 29%. If she has a female, it's lower than the 29%, but it's still around that kind of number.
Well, that was a lot of information that Dr. Hyman just shared with us. So why don't we recap some of the major points? One of the first big points is that there clearly is a strong genetic component to Tourette's syndrome. And these come from both familial studies where we look at family pedigrees as well as twin studies. And it's also quite clear that genetically, Tourette's syndrome, as well as what would be considered chronic tic disorders, are actually genetically linked. And so from a genetic perspective, we cannot really think of them as separate disorders. The second point is that Dr. Hyman came up with this slightly different way of thinking about inheritance. And we're not talking about heritability, which is a slightly complicated term, but rather he's introducing a new term known as recurrence risk. And that is basically the likelihood that you, as a person who has either chronic tic disorder or Tourette's, what is the chance that one of your offspring will also have a chronic tic disorder or Tourette's? And the number that he came up with from all of his studies, looking at thousands of families, is 29%. And as he emphasized, this is only an average number. And if you have a boy, the chances, the recurrence risk is slightly higher, around 34%. And if you have a daughter, then the recurrence risk is lower, around 24%. Thank you so much for watching this first video. I hope you found it informative. And I'm going to continue in this series on the genetics of Tourette's in my second video that we will post on Wednesday, where I continue my conversation with Dr. Hyman. And there I'm going to discuss two topics that I find quite interesting. One is there a genetic basis to tic severity? And the second topic is I'm going to explore with him the genetic basis of comorbid disorders such as obsessive compulsive disorder known as OCD or ADHD, and to what extent is there a strong genetic link between Tourette's and one of these comorbid disorders. So hopefully you can join me next Wednesday where we will continue our conversation with Dr. Hyman. Thank you again and see you Wednesday. If you're feeling generous, please consider making a small donation to the Pennsylvania Tourettes Syndrome Alliance, also known as PATSA. Like many of the local organizations in your community, if you're not from Pennsylvania, PATSA is so good at providing the support that kids need who have Tourette's, and they're really the boots on the ground helping educate parents and especially teachers in the schools to create a nurturing and supportive environment for these kids and really help them move forward. So please consider contributing. Thank you so much and see you in the next video.